Okay, hi guys and welcome to the show. Today I'm going to be sharing my top 5 tips to finding the perfect sized wristwatch for your wrist. And before I get into this, I'll do a quick wristwatch check. This is the Squale 1521, the beautiful blue version, and I've put it on a mesh stainless steel Milanese bracelet just to give it a bit of a change. I think it really works. I haven't worn this for quite a while, and because I've got a duel coming up, a comparison between this and the new Glycine Combat Sub that I just recently reviewed, I thought I'd get reacquainted with this much beloved piece. Okay, so wristwatch check done. Let's get on with the video. Welcome back guys. Now this video is a bit of a response to a recent video I saw on the Real Men Real Style channel hosted by Antonio. It was a pretty good video, however there were some things I thought that were left out, and you know, it's not Antonio's fault. You know, he's quite new to watch collecting. These are things that you really only pick up through decades of collecting watches and having experienced, well, thousands of watches, to be honest, because there is a kind of art to finding the right watch and the right fit. You can look at all the measurements and all the features of the watch, but because each watch is different in design, from the curvature of the lugs to all these kind of different components, there isn't any really set rules. Every particular watch is different, and the 1521, for example, is a really good example of this, because this, according to its measurements, should be too big for me, but because of this very unique designed case that's become quite iconic with the Squale Diver watches, it fits a whole variety of different wrists, including very skinny wrists like mine. And that kind of brings me on to my number 5 guideline, and we'll count down from 5 to 1, and that is to always try before you buy. Now, the Squale 1521 is a little bit difficult to do that because it's a niche brand, it's very specialized, it's not something that, you know, you can go down to Macy's or a department store in the mall and find. There's only a few retail stores, and I believe most of them are in Italy and Switzerland and places like that. It's a brand that, you know, connoisseurs really only know about. You know, it's a small, very particular brand. So it's not that widely available, but you know, I took a bit of a risk with this, and thankfully it turned out fine. But you see, this is where decades of experience kind of come in. I've made many mistakes over the years of not trying before I buy, and I really urge you, if possible, to always try on a watch before you make that purchasing decision, before you pull the trigger on spend, and especially if you're spending a lot of money. If it's a luxury piece, don't be shy at going into the boutique. If it's a Rolex or an Omega or something like that, you know, go in as many times as you can. Even different seasons can affect how a watch fits your wrist. In hotter weather, your skin expands and it wears differently to colder weather. Now, of course, you can adjust the band and all of these little things like that, but really you want to try a watch on as many times as possible before you make that decision. Okay, so that was my number 5. Now, my number 4 guideline is scale. Now, what do I mean by scale? I mean how it fits to the wearer, and scale is different for everybody. For example, I have very skinny little wrists. I have big hands but skinny wrists, which is a bit of an unusual combination. So for me, I have to go with medium to smaller sized watches. If you are a larger gentleman or you have thicker wrists, then obviously you want to go towards the larger sizes. But what's important to notice here is that scale is relative to the wearer. don't fall under peer pressure. You know, don't go for larger watches because your friends have larger watches. You know, it's got to be relative to your scale. For example, a great example of this is the Omega Seamaster. There is the standard, I think it's 41.5 millimeter. It might be, I think it's 41.5 millimeter diameter version, and then there's the mid-size. Now, certain people dismiss the mid-size as a ladies' watch, but it's not at all. In fact, I think it's Prince William wears a mid-size that was given to him by Princess Diana. So, you know, don't be afraid of the mid-sizes if you want to go for something a little bit smaller. So, it's always important to keep your scale in mind when picking a size of a watch. Okay, so number 3. Now, this is something that Antonio failed to, well, he kind of touched on a little bit, but is the genre or style of watch. For example, an aviation piece like this Breitling Navitimer, these are traditionally supposed to be a little bit bigger, and this is for good reason. If you look back in the early aviation pieces, for example, the famous German Flieger watches that were worn by pilots at the beginning of the century, especially in the World War II, these were huge watches. Sometimes they were as big as 50 millimeters in diameter, and that was for very good reason, because it was worn on the outside of a flight suit. They had goggles on. They needed something that was very legible because their life is depending on it. They're using these instruments while they are piloting a plane, and so they wanted something legible that was easy to see. So traditionally, aviation watches have been a little larger. For example, this is a very complicated piece because we have a lot going on the dial. This has an inner rotating bezel to do all kinds of fuel consumption, distance traveled, all these kind of calculations. So traditionally aviation watches were always a little bit bigger, so there was space for all of this information on the dial. Likewise can be said about diving watches. These often are very kind of, I mean, these are sports tool watches, right? So in the early days of diving, when your life depended on your watch, timing the dive itself with the bezel, for example, it had to be legible, especially underwater, and also easy to grip with if you're wearing gloves and that kind of thing. With tool watches, you know, it's acceptable to go a little bit bigger. Now, the opposite can be said about dress watches. Dress watches have always been, especially towards the middle of the century, a lot smaller. In fact, a lot of watchmakers were in competition to see who could make the thinnest or smallest dress watches, because it was a sign of refinement, of a higher level of craftsmanship by the watchmaker. So for dress watches, you always want to go smaller and thinner. And for a more formal attire, a dress watch also looks more sophisticated if it's a more traditional or conservative size. There's nothing more kind of unrefined looking than a really big, loud wristwatch with a nice suit, for example. So when deciding a watch size, always keep in mind in what situation you're going to be using it in. So if you're wearing a suit most of the time, then you're going to want to wear something that is more small and more traditional. If, for example, you're very active and have an active lifestyle, then obviously you want to go something larger and reflects that lifestyle. Okay, so the style of watch, that was my third guideline. So my second guideline is the components of a watch. There's a lot of different things that kind of dictate the size and how a watch feels. From the material of the band, if you have stainless steel or leather or rubber, for example, or different fabrics or NATO band, that can dramatically change the fit and feel of a watch. Likewise, things like pushers, the crown guards, the shape of the lugs, things like that, that can also be a huge deciding factor in how a watch fits. So always keep that in mind. But nothing changes a watch's fit and feel more than the actual band itself. I've found that if you have smaller wrists and you want a watch to wear a bit smaller, then stainless steel bands really do help that, because they make the watch sit up a little bit more confidently. And the opposite can be said about leather bands and NATO straps. Generally, the material and style of the band is a big factor. For example, on this mesh bracelet, there's a lot of extra bracelet which is folded under, and that actually makes the watch sit a bit more bit more solidly on my tiny wrist. And I mean, I wear my watches quite loose, but it actually makes a larger watch feel much more comfortable. And the same works in the opposite fashion. So if you have a small watch and you want to wear it on a larger wrist, NATO straps, rubber straps, leather straps really help that. Okay, so that was not my second guideline. Now my number one thing is, of course, the measurements and dimensions of a watch. Now Antonio in his video talked about this, but he actually missed out a few crucial things, and it's not his fault. It's something that, you know, watch fans or people that know about watches take years to pick up, so it's not his fault at all. To be honest, it's something that's taken me years to realize, and that is to do with the dimensions. Now this is a really good example. This is the Glycine Combat Sub. Now we'll go over the basic measurements very quickly on this watch. So we have the diameter, which is basically from here to here, right? Then we have the lug to lug width, which is from here to here, right? And this is also very crucial, and something that a lot of people miss out. Then of course we have the thickness of the watch, and that determines how tall it sits on your wrist. For example, that's from top of the watch to here. And then lastly we have the lug width, which is from here to here, and the thickness of the strap or band. So those are the basic measurements. Now what a lot of people, the mistake they make is they think that the diameter determines the fit and feel of a watch. Well, most of the time, I would say about 75% of the time, if you go with for example, a 38mm watch, it's going to wear smaller obviously than a 42mm watch. But you know, there are exceptions. These two are probably great examples of exceptions. Both of these watches are 42mm in diameter. However, because of the measurement from lug to lug, from here to here, is smaller, and the curvature of these lugs here, they really do hug the wrist, and they work very well on smaller wrists. So there are always exceptions to these measurement rules, and that's why you almost go back to my fifth rule, is trying before you buy. So not always does the diameter dictate how a watch fits. Another thing is height. Always try and go with thinner watches. It's just, you know, thinner is always more comfortable. Especially with dress watches, for example, thinner is better because it doesn't catch on the cuff. If you're wearing, you know, button-down shirts with long sleeves, you want something that glides under the cuff. So those are the dimensions that you really want to look out for. But I say again, it doesn't always accurately dictate how a watch fits. Because, for example, the Glycine Combat Sub, in theory, it should be too big for me. However, it's got to be one of the most comfortable watches I've ever worn, and I really prefer smaller watches. However, this is a pretty big watch. But because it's so thin, and because of the curvature of these lugs, and the measurement from lug width from lug to lug here is quite small, it really does wear smaller. So there are always exceptions. Anyway guys, that is my top 5 tips or guidelines. Now of course it's not anything written in stone. You know, you don't have to pay any attention to me whatsoever. You know, you could feel completely the opposite about all of these things. However, in my experience over the last couple of decades of buying and selling watches and collecting myself, I've found these things really invaluable to finding a comfortable fit of a watch. Please share down below any kind of extra tips or advice you may have. I'm always willing to hear, and a lot of great advice is always in the comments, so I really do appreciate that. So please, in the comments below, any kind of extra, you know, an extra guideline I can add to this list is always very much appreciated. Anyway guys, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very, very much for watching. Please remember to like this video if you enjoyed it and found it useful, and I'll definitely catch you in the next one. Okay guys, ciao.